Okay, so this particular EdPuzzle is going to focus on the tissues that we find in typical seed plants in particular. So stems, leaves, roots, the different tissue types, and the different jobs that can be done by stems, leaves, and roots. All three of those have sort of a predominant function, and then they have other things that they can be sort of co-opted to be used for, depending on the situation. We'll talk a little bit about fruit and how fruit is different from a seed. So of course we're talking about angiosperms. This is a shared derived character for angiosperms. Gymnosperms of course have seeds but no fruit.
Okay, another big deal about angiosperms, right, besides flowers, is fruit. This is something you do not see in gymnosperms, right? Gymnosperms, we've got naked seeds. And in angiosperms, we have the seed that is wrapped in various things, but essentially it is usually the wall of the ovary. The seed, of course, is basically a seed is just a fertilized ovule. So in most cases, you have the ovary wall that thickens. It thickens to varying degrees. It often includes other parts of the flower or other parts of the plant. So for example, strawberries. What the part that we like, the part that tastes so good, right? That nice ruby red fruit is actually not fruit. It's the part that's called the receptacle. It's a swollen part of the stem below the flower, and you could actually see the leftover parts of the flower on the strawberry itself, and all the little things that are on the outside that we think are seeds. Well, they are seeds, except they're seeds that are wrapped in ovary wall. So they're essentially little teeny tiny fruits called achenes. It's another one of those lovely bits of trivia that you can use to fascinate people and stump people in Trivial Pursuit and stuff like that. But anyway, those tiny little things that look like seeds, and you actually can tell that it's a fruit because if you look at those tiny seeds and really look closely, you can actually see what's left of the carpel that's sticking up. There's a little piece that sticks up, this is the style that's sticking up. And so you can actually tell that it is a fruit rather than a seed itself. Obviously, it contains a seed. So if you cut it in half, you're going to have the outer wall, which is the ovary wall, and then you're going to be able to see the integument and the seed with the embryo inside. And so again, fruits can be they can be dry, like those achenes, or are grains. Wheat, of course, is a fruit. The bran part that that's so good for you is the outer fruit part, right? And then you have the seed that's inside that contains all of those wonderful omega-3 fatty acids that are so good for us. And then, of course, you have the typical fruits. Anything with a seed, right, is a fruit. So here we've got a tomato. And so this is all, you'll notice that all this fleshy part, right? So this is all ovary. And then, of course, you've got all the little seeds, which I've got red on red, doesn't really help. So all those little seeds. And those, of course, are the seeds. And so we have the ovary, right, which is, this is the fruit. So you have, again, fleshy fruits. What's the joke? Knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is not using it in a fruit salad, right? So anything with seeds is a fruit. Cucumbers, right? When you think of cucumbers as vegetables, it's a fruit. It's got seeds. It's a fruit. Vegetables, strictly speaking, right, are other parts of the plant. So like celery is a stem. So that would be, the stalk of the celery. You can actually see the vascular tissue, right? It's got leaves. It's pretty obvious it's a vegetable part, or you're eating the flowers, or you're eating other parts of the plant, the roots and things like that. But not technically fruit. As long as it doesn't have, if it has seeds, it's fruit. And again, what's great thing about seeds, the purpose of fruit is dispersal. That is its only job. The fruit does not contain any, strictly speaking, any nutrients for the developing embryo. All of that is contained inside the seed. So the seed has everything that that baby plant needs. The fruit's job is to get that seed as far from the parent plant as possible. Okay, so I'm going to say fruit's job is dispersal. That is its only job, right? So fruit basically contains no nutrients for the embryo. All of that's inside the seed, right? The seed does that. Nutrients for the embryo, right? That's going to be inside the seed. The job of fruit is dispersal. So this could be a fleshy fruit that attracts an animal to eat it, and the animal eats the fruit, digests it. The seeds pass unharmed through the digestive tract and are deposited along with a nice load of fertilizer in a new location, maybe miles away from the parent plant. Some fruits are picked up by the wind and whisked away to parts unknown, right? So the dandelions or milkweeds or something like that that are releasing the seeds into the wind and have some sort of, again, the fruit part of our lovely our dandelion, right? So this is the seed is inside here, and then this is mostly this is the fruit part, but it's also including this bit here. So the seed is inside. Some, of course, are sticky. Whoops. Some of them are sticky, and again, cling to the fur of animals or get picked up by birds and deposited elsewhere. So again, the seeds are inside the ovary and inside the fruit, and not sitting on top of a modified leaf. Other than the fact that the ovary wall is a modified leaf, but you don't have naked seeds. You have fruit in angiosperms. Okay, we talked about most of this already when we talked about the benefits of biodiversity and the importance of that to humans, right? So plant chemical extracts and especially flowering plants have been hugely important sources of different kinds of medications. Now we've got, in fact, was it turmeric on there? No, it's not on there. Okay. We're looking at turmeric for its anti-cancer properties. All of the different polyphenol chemicals in the peppercorn extract and cinnamon, some other spices in addition to flavors that are yummy and we really enjoy them. We are discovering that they have all sorts of beneficial medicinal properties. And so those plant extracts, and we're going to talk about the next section, where those chemicals come from and what those actually are. But yeah, in addition to food source for humans, and again, about 80% of our calories come from major carb sources that are plants, basically, right? Potatoes, corn, wheat, cassava. For those of you who like, boba, which yum, love that. Rice, tapioca, sweet potatoes, all those things are structures that plants are using to store their calories, and we're harvesting them as a food source. So hugely important for, again, food, building materials, medicines, and all sorts of things like that, different products of biodiversity. that perform a specific function. And many times those tissues are organized together into organs that are working together, those tissues working together to, again, perform a particular function. And so we have two main systems in plants. We have roots and shoots, essentially are two opposing apical meristems, right? You have one meristem that is growing down into the soil, going after water and nutrients and other resources, and you have a system that is growing up towards the light. That is the shoot, of course. That's where the photosynthesis is happening in the leaves. And of course, all the sugar that's produced in the leaves as a result of photosynthesis needs to get to other parts of the plant where it's needed, right? Other parts of the plant that don't do photosynthesis. That's where the phloem comes in, that vascular tissue. Leaves also need access to water and minerals and things that are coming up from the soil. And of course, that's where the xylem comes in. So we have two main types of growth in plants, and this is true for other multicellular organisms too, right? You have growth of the body, and then you have reproductive growth of reproductive organs and reproductive effort. And of course, we know we can't maximize both of those things. You have trade-offs that exist. So vegetative growth is what, for most plants, this takes up most of their energy budget. In terms of annual plants, a very our selected life history strategy, they don't tend to get as big, and so they reach that trade-off point earlier than, say, more K-selected plants, where essentially they grow as quickly as they possibly can, and then they switch over into growth of reproductive structures. Whereas K-selected plants, like an oak tree, are going to spend a lot of time and energy growing their stems and their leaves and their roots, and then eventually they'll switch and start making reproductive structures also. Okay, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this particular slide, and no, you do not need to memorize this or be able to draw this particular image. Although again, if you can label the parts, then you're in very good shape for the lab practical, if you understand all those the tissues and sort of how they work together. But predominantly just pointing out the main features that we are interested in, right? So in terms of adaptations in plants, right? So again, this is a leaf. This is the light gathering organ. This is that's its main job. But as we'll see, not necessarily the only job that leaves do. Feature of leaves, right? We're going to see this cuticle, right? This is that waxy layer that helps retain water. It helps the plant retain water. One of those early features of early land plants that allowed them to function in an air-based environment. And then, of course, this is well, it's a plant. I should say it's a plant. It's most likely a seed plant. And we've got vascular tissue, right? We have xylem and phloem together. And then we've got the guard cells, right? And these are what is holding, this is the stomata. And so here's our little stomata here, right? So this is the stomata. And that, of course, is those openings that are allowing carbon dioxide to come in, also allowing oxygen to leave, because we know oxygen interferes with the Calvin cycle, right? And so you don't want oxygen to build up in the tissue in the plant to too high of a level, because it'll interfere with photosynthesis. So you want to be able to get rid of that. And again, those stomata, we have a very high surface area to volume ratio, which is Great for gas exchange, but it also means we're going to lose water like nobody's business. And so that's where having the ability to close your stomata on a hot day is so important for so many of our plants if you want to be able to function in an environment that's not very cool and moist, like a forest, for example. So yeah, don't worry too much about the structures on this page, except for the vascular tissue, the cuticle, and the stomata. Okay, so as I mentioned, yeah, the primary job of leaves is light capture and photosynthesis, but definitely not their only potential job. And so we have leaves that we've already seen leaves specialized for particular functions, right? Flowers are modified leaves specialized for sexual reproduction. We also see asexual reproduction in leaves that are gathered around nodes on stems, and you can actually form an entirely new organism from there through the process of budding. All you need is the apical meristem, right, and some other bits. And so you can take cuttings from plants, for example, and have asexual reproduction there. Of course, you can have water storage. So this is the plant on the top right is an aloe plant. And it has that, of course, that gel, the aloe gel, which has other chemical properties that we enjoy that are nice for sunburns and things like that. But it's also mostly water. So that's the purpose of that particular structure, that particular leaf shape is holding on to water in a dry environment. And then, of course, you also have defensive structures. So interestingly, thorns and cactus spines, for example, are modified leaves that have been hardened and sharpened for defensive purposes. Okay, so as I mentioned, right, tissues are cells that are working together to serve a common purpose, right, perform a particular function. And plants have three main tissue types. One is ground tissue. This is the bulk of the plant. Is ground. So we sort of think about that as like our mesoderm. It's sort of what most of our body is made of. It's the middle bit. So it's generally, that's where all the metabolic functions are happening, right? It's all in the middle. And then you have the dermal tissue. This is the outer layer. It's sort of analogous to our skin, for example. This is where you find the cuticle. And this is also where you find a lot of plant defensive capabilities, either physical defenses, like trichomes. These are the little hairs that we're seeing on the tomato plant on the bottom photograph. All those little fuzzy hairs. They can be actually quite spiky and sharp. They can be sticky or just really, really dense. And they actually serve multiple purposes. One is actually reducing water loss. Because they keep the air from moving across the surface of the epidermal surface of the plant. And that helps to essentially prevent evaporation from occurring from the surface. So it helps retain water. But their big job is protecting the plant from insects. And it's complicated. Like a lot of relationships are complicated, right? Plants have complicated relationships with insects. And it's kind of interesting because a lot of times the adult, for example, I'm thinking of a monarch butterfly, right? The adult is very important in pollinating the plant and going from flower to flower and picking up the pollen and spreading it all around, and it serves an important function for the plant. But the caterpillar stage, right, the larval stage of the butterfly, eats plant tissue, which is not something the plant is in favor of having happen, right? You don't want those herbivores grazing on your nice tender plant bits, right? It's not nice. Stop chewing on me. And so we have this sort of love relationship in terms of the pollination, but then you have the hate relationship also in terms of the damage to other parts of the plant, or even eating their flowers before the flowers have had a chance to open, for example. And so protecting themselves from insect or other herbivore damage is a big job for the dermal tissue. So you have physical defenses with the trichomes, but you also have chemical defenses, and this is where all of those compounds that I was talking about in the last section when we were looking at spices, for example, a lot of those secondary compounds are contained in the dermal layer, and a lot of them are bitter, they're nasty tasting, and they're essentially, their purpose is to repel herbivores. But what's interesting is a lot of those chemicals actually have medicinal properties, and so we have been isolating a whole area of scientific study, looking at isolating those compounds and asking, what do these do? They're really complicated chemicals. Can we break them down into their component pieces and find out, compare them to analogous chemicals in our body and find out what do these chemicals do? Some of them have proven to be very effective pain relievers, for example. Or I was mentioning, the potential for anti-cancer drugs or antioxidants to protect your immune system. And the list really goes on and on and on. So again, a big argument if anyone asks you why should protect biodiversity and why we care about plants other than the fact that we eat them, that whole wanting to eat thing. Other than that, yeah, if you want to have sources of new medicines, new cures for disease, the plants are going to hold the key to that. And of course, our third tissue type is one we visited before already. This is the vascular tissue, right? So this is xylem and phloem. And so we have a nice little schematic there of the xylem on the right with the tracheids. And you can see we've got one-way transport of water and minerals from the root to the shoot. And then we've got a really nice close-up scanning electron microscope photo of phloem, and specifically the plates in between, basically making up the boundaries between the cells in the phloem. And the holes are going to allow certain things to freely flow through, and they're going to start holding back some chemicals, and it essentially allows the plant to create a gradient to concentration gradients within the plant itself. And we know everything likes to flow from high to low, high concentration to low concentration. That's essentially what phloem is allowing to happen, depending on where those sugars need to be used. Most of the year, most plants are producing more sugar than is being used in the leaves, and that extra sugar gets transported by the phloem down the plant, and meanwhile, recharging all the cells along the way and feeding the root cells, as well as possibly storing any extra sugar in the roots. This is a really common mechanism for plants, and we're going to revisit this later on when we talk about what happens when plants are coming out, when trees especially are coming out of hibernation, really, in the springtime, and they change in direction in the phloem that we see. Okay, so I mentioned this earlier when we talked about xylem and how the water and the minerals get from the roots up to the shoots. And of course, it's because we have evaporation from the surface of the leaf. And this is going to be maybe a low level in certain times of day, or it's higher levels on warm afternoons, for example. But you're always going to have some evaporation of water from the stomata and from the surface of the leaf. And because of hydrogen bonding, right, you can actually see in this little schematic here, all of those water molecules are all connected to each other by hydrogen bonds between the water molecules. And it's essentially like having a very, very, very long string of pearls. And you're pulling that string up, and you're pulling on one part of it, and it pulls up the rest of the strand along with it. And so it's creating that cohesive property of water is allowing the water to get pulled up through the xylem from the root to the shoot. It also can crawl up the sides of the tracheids, right, which the tracheids are made of cellulose in the cell walls, and cellulose is a very hydrophilic molecule. It's a water-loving molecule, and so it attracts water to it, and that allows that water to essentially crawl up the sides of the tracheids, again, against gravity. This is the same thing, right, when you have a broken pipe in your house, and you get a puddle of water on the floor, but you also often get water damage going up the wall, and it's the water crawling up the wall. It's a result of adhesion, water molecules adhering to and hydrogen bonding with the polar molecules in that particular case in the drywall, in the wall. It's all cellulose based. So this is a process we call evapotranspiration, or sometimes just transpiration. And that's how the water from the roots can reach the leaves where it's needed for photosynthesis. Okay, so a little bit different from transpiration is translocation. So basically just moving things around, right? And this is what's going on with phloem. So this is what I was talking about earlier, when you have essentially supply and demand. Most of the time you have more sugar being produced in the leaves than the leaves need at night to do cellular respiration. And so all the extra, right, everything wants to go high to low. So all the extra gets essentially pulled down the plant to the stem and the roots, which are the cells that are needing to do cellular respiration. They need a source of energy, and that's the sugar that's coming from the photosynthesis. So it's essentially moving from a source to a sink. Again, we have a lot of different storage organs that can be sources or sinks. A lot of times, trees, for example, will store extra sugar in their roots, and they'll be basically banking that sugar for most of the year. And that's what's sustaining them through the winter. And then in the springtime, that's what they mobilize to essentially fund or pay for the energy that's required to manufacture flowers and new leaves in the spring. You'll notice, I don't know if you guys noticed this in this spring, which is kind of messed up because of the stupid virus thing. But on campus, we had very, very early spring this year. And so in February, we had flowers, we had trees blooming on campus. But you notice it was covered in blossoms, but there were no leaves. So they didn't do photosynthesis and then use that to pay for making flowers. They had to make the flowers first. And so to provide the energy for that, they're relying on the stored sugar in their roots from previous years. And so this is what leads to what we call the running of the sap, if anybody is an aficionado of maple syrup, right? So the maple syrup runs, right, early in spring. It's the phloem, essentially, that you're tapping, that's coming up from the roots out to the shoots, and that's what the shoots are using to build flowers, to pay for the energy to make flowers and eventually fruit and new leaves. That's where all of that energy is coming from, that stored sugar from previous years. Okay, so just like we talked about with leaves having multiple jobs, right? The big job is being light capture, but they can be used for other purposes as well. We see the same thing with stems. So stems, their predominant job, right, is lifting the leaves up towards the light. They're sort of the backbone or the skeleton or the support system for plants. But you can also have stems that are storing sugar underground. These would be things like rhizomes and tubers. Bulbs are underground shoots. So you have, let me see if I can get my pen to work for me here, right? So here I've got, right, there's the roots, the short stem, very, very short stem here. And of course, these are all the leaves. We have nice fleshy leaves. So this is where all the sugar is stored. And you have a very short stem there. So an underground shoot is a bulb. This is a modified stem. And then of course you've got the rhizomes and tubers. Right, so I'm just going to actually just show it right here, like right, I got my little eyes, right? So these are the, right, the eyes on your potato. Are nodes. Oops, that looks like it's all one word. Those are the nodes. So basically a node, right, is just an axillary bud. And that's what tells you that it's a stem, right? So you can tell if something is a stem rather than a root, if they've got and if they have nodes on them, right? So what happens with your potatoes if you leave them too long, right? They start to sprout. And the only reason they can sprout is because you have nodes of axillary bud tissue on the stem itself. And so those are just underground storage, right? Potatoes, you're storing starch, which is basically the plant's version of glycogen for sugar storage purposes. And then, of course, you have asexual reproduction also possible through the stems. You actually have a combination, right? Because we've got, these are plantlets. So we have basically these are, again, the axillary buds that are forming along the stem. And you have a whole new plant that forms, puts down roots, and eventually if something happens to sever the stem connection, it's okay because you have a brand new plant at that particular node. This is a very common form of reproduction in some plants like strawberries. Okay, roots, again, primary job is anchoring and nutrient absorption once we actually had true roots, right? Not rhizoids. But once you had roots, right, they could absorb water and minerals on their own. They don't necessarily need the mycorrhizae anymore, but it's still highly beneficial to have those, especially in younger plants. And we're going to be looking at that next time when we look at fungi. We'll talk about the importance of mycorrhizae to plant growth, even in seed plants that don't necessarily need that close relationship. Not as much as those early plants certainly did, now that they have roots, right? So again, anchoring, water, mineral, sugar storage. So you may get a very long, skinny root like we see here, which is going straight down, going deep into the soil, going for the groundwater. This is great for plants that are planning on getting very, very tall. You have a nice deep anchor with all of the lateral roots that we see here in this photograph. And in our very young plants, generally we see root hairs. And you see this in the taproot as well on the ends, but not as much. These are just really, really tiny, almost like trichomes. They're very thin tubes that are extending from the surface of the root. And their main job, of course, is water and nutrient absorption. So that's mostly where you're getting that absorption coming in, is that high surface area of the root hair. Okay, so we also have situations where you have roots forming in maybe places that are a little bit unusual. This is usually forming from axillary buds, and I'm actually just going to put that right on here. So usually, oh fudge. I didn't say fudge. Sorry. Axillary buds. Anybody who's seen A Christmas Story knows exactly what I'm talking about. Okay. I didn't say fudge joke. Okay. So yeah, adventitious roots are just roots that are forming an unusual place. It's again usually from a node. These can be roots that form as part of asexual reproduction with plantlets and budding, or they can be like we see with the fibrous roots in the grasses here. And so that's again, grasses, you don't generally see a tap root, a single root going down. They have roots that branch out and form a very complex network, which is great for holding the grass in place. It's great for holding the topsoil in place. And this is why we have such a problem with mudslides after a fire. For example, you've taken out everything above ground, and so your grasses are gone, and you don't really have anybody there to hold on to that topsoil and prevent it from sliding off if you happen to have a fire followed by very heavy rains. Then you can get mudslides, right? And you've lost your topsoil. Or in the case of situations like the Great Dust Bowl, where the plants were basically all dying. It was a huge drought. They hadn't had rain in ages. The grasses were all dead, and there was nothing to hold on to the topsoil. It was literally blowing away. It was an absolute mess. So just like the stems and leaves, roots can be modified for other jobs, as well as anchoring and nutrient absorption. They can be used to store carbohydrates. So a good example of a taproot that's being used to store sugar is, of course, a carrot. Notice how sweet carrots are. One of the reasons we like them because they're yummy, and it's all that stored sugar from the plant. Okay, they can also be adapted for extra functions. There we go, I've got a picture. In addition to anchoring, they can actually also provide above ground structural support. These are what are called buttress roots or prop roots. So here we've got a photograph of I believe a mangrove in a mangrove swamp. And so the soil is saturated with water, which means it's really easy for the tree to topple over. We see this here when we have heavy rains for multiple days. Basically the soil gets waterlogged, and it's really hard for the roots, the below ground roots, the below the surface roots to hold on. And this is a situation in a habitat where that's the normal condition. So having that extra structural support keeps the tree from falling over. And likewise, in swampy conditions, you often see roots that are coming up from the ground. It's sort of opposite of what you expect to see, right? It's like, what the heck is this? And they're called pneumatophores, and they're roots that are essentially hollow tubes. It's like little straws. Or if you can think of it, it's sort of like a snorkel for plants, snorkel for a tree, right? Because roots are just like any other cell, right? Or any other aerobic cell. They need oxygen to do cellular respiration. And if you are essentially surrounded by water, right, there's not a lot of oxygen that's available, right? You've got water, but you don't have a lot of O2 gas, right? That's a problem. If you're a root cell, your problem is drowning. You don't have access to oxygen. Unfortunately, unlike our circulatory system, right, which we're moving oxygen as well as sugars and proteins and other things in our bloodstream. Plants can move sugar and protein and water and minerals, but not dissolved gases. They don't have a mechanism to move oxygen from one part of the plant to the other, which is sort of unfortunate, right? Because you've got oxygen being produced as a byproduct in the leaves, but you can't get that oxygen to the roots where it's needed. So this is a problem, right? This is why overwatering is such a problem, right? You end up with all those air pockets that had oxygen in them getting filled up with water. And so that you're essentially, those roots are drowning. And so the pneumatophores are a mechanism where you have essentially modified roots coming up from the bottom and siphoning air and essentially bringing oxygen to the root cells so that they don't die.